This is Ronald Reagan.
Yes, I had a feeling that it might be you.
Hey, you can have Kirby Puckett or you can have gay marriage, but you can't have both. Kirby Puckett died in 2006, and gay marriage was legalized in Minnesota in 2013. So,
suspicious.
I don't know why you're making it sound like it's such a clear choice. You know, Kirby Puckett, a couple World Series.
Kirby Puckett, I think, ended in somewat of a disgrace.
Well, he did, but he also had an eye retina problem, I think.
I don't know if that excuses it, but yeah.
No.
Well, how dare you? Just kidding. So real quick, I just wanted to talk about immigration.
I already know what you want to talk about. You want to talk about how
you're biased.
There was reports that in Britain they're already testing mRNA on people who have cancer, and B, coincidentally, King Charles has cancer and he was vaxxed.
Oh, I can't even listen to that.
Am I right?
I'm so devastated.
It's very interesting stuff you got there.
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan.
You're gonna call that a coincidence? I don't think so.
Ronald Reagan is an immigration attorney. Is that correct?
That's true. And I do mostly family and removal defense. But I have a really imperfect analogy. All the border talk reminds me of one summer I was eating a lot of watermelon. We have really good fresh watermelon in the Pacific Northwest, and I was starting to gain some weight, and I was telling my wife, that I was like, I think it's the watermelon. You know, I'm just eating too much watermelon. She's like, it could be the Haagen-Dazs, actually. And so that's how it feels a little bit when it's just like border, and it's like, you know, yeah, maybe it was a little bit too much watermelon, and this is where the analogy breaks down because immigrants are not watermelon, obviously, but just the idea that we're so hyper focused on this thing, this one element. And so I just wanted to walk through sort of the things that we deal with. First of all, like on the employment side, if you're a rural hospital and you want to get nurses, or you have a company and you want to get engineers or whatever, I don't practice that area of law, but it's a very frustrating, almost impossible process. It's very expensive. There are very limited visas. It's hard to get people to come do like important jobs. In terms of what we do, there's a visa called a U visa. It's for victims of crimes who help the police in investigating those crimes. There's a statutory cap of 10,000 visas per year, which was hit during the Obama administration, which means if you apply now for a U visa, you'll probably be waiting 10 to 15 years to get a U visa. So if you're an undocumented immigrant and you're raped or beaten or a victim of a crime, you can apply for this visa, but you're not going to get it for a really, really super long time. And during that time, by the way, you're not allowed to leave the country and come back. So you're stuck here. You can leave, but then you just have to wait out that processing time abroad. There's some undocumented immigrants who, if they marry a U.S. citizen, they have to go back to their country to get their green card. Part of that process is a waiver, which in the past would take anywhere from like 3 to 10 months to process, where basically you have to convince the government that your spouse will suffer extreme hardship if you're not allowed to return from your home country. And like I said, those used to take a couple of months, and now they're taking 4 years. So we have people who are married to U.S. citizens who filed petitions in 2019, and they're still waiting for just this one step in the process to be approved. There's DACA, but DACA is not taking new applicants, and it also requires that you have proof of your presence since 2007 in the United States. At this point, it's outdated, even if it were active and ongoing. And then in terms of the asylum system, you can apply for asylum through 2 different ways. If you're in removal proceedings and the people coming through the border, they get placed in removal proceedings, their hearings are before the immigration court, which has a backlog of over 1 million cases. Those cases routinely take a really super long time. We've had cases recently that of people who came in 2015 or 2016. Or you can apply with USCIS, and that's for people who are just here. Maybe they entered on a visa, or they they're not in active removal proceedings. And at a recent conference, a representative from USCIS said that they have over 1 million pending cases, and they were able to process something like 40,000 cases last year, which if you do the math, it's like a 50-year backlog of processing asylum applications. And part of the problem, this is a small part of the problem in my opinion, but it's part of the problem for sure, is that there's fraudsters and bad lawyers who use the backlog as a way to just tell people like, give me $15,000 and I'll get you a work permit. And they file an affirmative asylum application for somebody who doesn't qualify, but they get a work permit after 6 months. And so the person thinks they've got a green card. It's not a green card. And those things sort of spread like wildfires in different communities.
Well,
and so,
it's like anything like Raygun, like putting that kind of, without standardizing and modernizing this process, it just creates a whole underground kind of black market for exploiting people trying to come to this country.
Yeah, for sure. And it does become a de facto amnesty, which on the one hand, I'm okay with. Not people not getting deported, but on the other hand, if you have a valid asylum claim, you should have it heard earlier than 50 years, obviously, right, so that you can get your green card and then eventually become a citizen and vote. We're so quick to say no, they're not voting, and really, which is true. But the argument we should be making is that they should be allowed to vote much sooner, obviously. But yeah, the whole thing is totally broken. And one thing that has sort of, I think, come true is that there are people coming to the border to seek asylum. And again, I don't think this is the majority of the people, but there are people who are hearing that the border is open. And that's the reason why they're coming, sometimes in cases, not very often, but sometimes in cases where they otherwise would not have come. So they maybe don't have a valid asylum claim per se, but they've been hearing over and over again about how open the border is. And this is all driven by right-wing narratives, obviously. That's the only place that they're hearing that the border is open, because Kamala Harris went to Guatemala and told people not to come here. So the Democrats have been trying to say how closed the border is and how tough they are. And it's the Republicans who are signaling no, actually the border is super open and you can get here super easily. And those messages, again, I have no problem with people coming here, but the reality is just that
we don't have the mechanical capacity because of underfunding. The parts of the immigration bill that were helpful were we're going to hire more judges or magistrates, essentially, and that type of thing. But I'll tell you something. Yeah. If I was let's say I was a right-wing operative, the kind of person who would, do AI of, let's say, Joe Biden, telling people when to vote, or the type of people who've gone to jail, from what they did in New Hampshire, or, Roger Stone, or, one of those type, I might be seeding stories of an open border throughout Central and Latin America, and in maybe other places that are as a way of, enhancing their narrative that the border is being, overrun, essentially.
Right.
That would be an effective thing to do in that instance.
And the last thing, I guess, I think with the amount of news that there is, and 24-hour cable news channels and things like that, the fact that there's literally zero coverage about things that are happening in the places that people are fleeing from is another example of why are we focused on, why was I focused on the fact that I was eating too much watermelon and not the fact that I was not exercising at all. It's we talk to people all day long who had nice lives in Mexico or wherever. They were happy to be living there. They lived in cool places, beautiful places. But they happened to be in the middle of a cartel war. with like very, very powerful cartels. They were personally threatened or run out of town. We don't get a lot of people from like Cancun or places that, people, in other words, like the idea that everyone in the world just wants to be here so bad because it's like so sick to live in the United States is not true. And there need to be more stories about like the push factors,
yes,
not just the pull factors.
Honduras
like
being one of the most dangerous places in the world.
AOC seemed to like be starting this last summer when she's talking about Venezuela, and like maybe we should look at that, and we just haven't. There was no follow through on that from the leadership.
Well, there's two things. One is to look at the situation as it exists now in a lot of these places, which are extremely dangerous, and in some other places with a total lack of opportunity. But then the other is to put it in historical context and look back and see why that's the case, is because in nascent democracies and in frankly functioning societies, the United States wanted to secure its business interests and its ownership of whether it was bananas or whatever it was at any given point. And we destabilized countries, sometimes repeatedly, in such a way that ended up leaving a lot of these places with a civil society that was incredibly fragmented and susceptible to corruption and rampant, and roving gangs of drug cartels.
Right. This is anecdotal, but in my experience, if I talk to somebody who came in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, a lot of times it was so-called economic migration, which is apparently, such a bad thing. Somebody who just comes because they were living in poverty. But even in those cases, people were going hungry or unable to feed their kids. So they came here to work in an industry that where we need workers. So it seems like a win-win. And I don't really hear those stories anymore. Now it's, the cartel came to my door and said, if I don't pay them this much money per month, they were going to, do whatever. And so the stories have changed and the situation has become unstable, I think. And yeah, I mean, there's just been no effort to message that or to talk about how the system overall is broken. It's just a classic sort of like, we're going to get out there and we're going to look tough. We're going to show that we're super duper tough. We're more tough than the other guys. And, it's just too bad. It seems like a real missed opportunity to educate people. And I know it's easy to think or to hope that they could wave a magic wand or whatever. But it's also frustrating that, and I know that's not possible, but it's frustrating that during a campaign, Obama has the money to run a 30-minute ad on every major network talking about how great Obama is, or during the impeachment hearings, they were able to run hearings on prime time to try and educate people. So in other words, there's creative tools that can be used to get some of this out there. And it's just, there's no energy there.
Yep.
It's very, very frustrating.
No will either.
Anyways.
Appreciate the call.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks. We'll clip that call. People want that clip so they can send it to people to educate. Also, I mean, again, this is it is a lot to ask. Well, it shouldn't be a lot to ask of our media to explicate these things outside of a political context. They don't do it. And so when you cede the argument, when you basically just say, we're not going to address the fundamental false premises of the Republicans, but rather we're going to act as if we buy into their fundamental premise, that's a disaster. It's a disaster, both from a policy standpoint and from the real world implications and also a disaster from like electoral politics that